Okay, good morning, everyone. So, few quick reminders. Lisa had provided it in the chat. So, just again, this meeting is being recorded. Please mute yourself if necessary. We may need to mute folks on the line if we do hear sort of excessive background while discussions are going on. And then again, this is the final workshop within the reform track. And then lastly, what she provided here is that the last set of informal comments will now be due on Friday, February 4th. Parties will be asked to provide their comments on all topics or all workshops. PG&E or the facilitators also plan to circulate a position matrix to the service list, and we'll ask that parties fill that out. So a lot of these next steps we'll cover towards the end, but sort of let's really get into this. So my name is Rhett Kikuyama. I work with PG&E, and I'll be facilitating today's workshop. So we do have a pretty packed agenda with a slew of topics, so I think we should sort of dive in. So first, let's cover safety message. So there are quite a few items on here, but maybe the most relevant are to continue taking precautions related to the COVID virus, wear masks when required, maintain social distancing, etc. And then I think probably the next important thing is to maintain an emergency preparedness kit, as there could be situations sort of including what happened over this past weekend with a tsunami, and just overall being prepared for things that we necessarily don't foresee or cannot foresee. So with that said, oh, I'm sorry, let me go to the agenda quickly, just so folks can see things. So we have, again, a pretty packed agenda. So we'll have CAISO present and Energy Division present from 10 to 12 on two different topics, or at least similar topics. We do plan to break for lunch at 12, between 12 and 12:30. Following that, we'll have SCE and Calpine present on penalties and backstop procurement. Short break, short 10-minute break, and then we'll dive into sort of multi-year and DR counting with a Q&A session towards the end. And then lastly, sort of follow up on next steps or identifying next steps as far as the working group report and getting us to that finish line. So with that said, let's dive in. So I'll hand it over to, I think it's Bridget Sparks with CAISO.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So let me pull up the slide deck real quick.
Hello?
Let's see. Can folks see the slide deck?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Okay.
Can we hear you?
Okay. Great.
We see the slide and then the sort of the slides on the side.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to be in full present mode or not.
I'm sorry. This is Elise with the Energy Commission. I am on the website trying to join, and the Teams meeting links are broken. Can somebody send me the correct link?
This is Lisa. I can maybe, who is this again? Sorry.
Elise Ernst with the Energy Commission. When I click on the links, they don't go anywhere. They say I can't be reached, and I've done it every which way. I don't know if everyone else is having that problem.
What's your name again?
Elise Ernst.
Got it.
Lisa
okay,
one. I just emailed you. Okay.
Okay,
Hi.
I'll work with you.
This is Paul Nelson. In the chat, I copied the link that I used successfully. So you might check the chat and see if you can click on that link.
I can't check the chat because I'm not in Teams, but I appreciate it. because I can't join the meeting. Thanks. So.
Okay.
Alrighty, can everyone see the full slide deck now?
I apologize. There are others who are clicking that same link, or at least I am, and getting to a site can't be reached. It looks like there's a preface to the actual meeting notice in the link itself that may be preventing that.
Okay, I'm sorry, Bridget. Could folks that have issues email me? My email, this is Lisa Wan from PG&E, and my email address is L2WG@PG&E. Again, that's L2WG@PG&E. And I'll work with folks to get them on the web, on the Teams. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa.
Bridget, your slide looks perfect.
Okay, great. Alrighty, so good morning, everyone. So plan for the CAISO's presentation.
Sorry to interrupt. Why don't you, for at least for a while, start saying what slide you are, so the people who may have advanced copies that can at least follow along, because they were emailed out to the distribution list. But go ahead and say what slide you're on.
Sure thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we're on page 2 of the agenda. And so today I plan to present on the use limited thermal data, the forced outages, an overview of the Ucap methodology that we presented on in October, as well as updated data, and then a short implementation discussion about how these reforms might work at the CAISO. So starting on page 4, parties requested information on the use limited thermal fleet. So the CAISO pulled monthly average PMAX totals for thermal resources that were registered as a fuel type of gas in master file, and either had a use limitation or a conditionally available resource flag. The sample only includes CAISO internal resources, so we don't look at TIGENs or EIM resources, and it includes QFs to the extent that they're registered as a gas resource. And then I also included the tariff definition of what a resource must do to qualify as use limited. And so they must meet all 3 criteria, where the resource has one or more limitations affecting the number of starts, its number of run hours, or its energy output due to a design consideration, environmental restrictions, or qualifying contractual limitations. And the CAISO market process used to dispatch the resource cannot recognize the resource's limitations. And third, the resource's ability to select hours of operation is not dependent on an energy source outside the resource's control, being available during hours, but the resource's usage needs to be rationed. So moving to page 5, this chart shows the use limited thermal fleet for 2021. And so here, the first column shows you how many PMAX megawatts of gas resources we have that are registered as non-use limited. And then the next column shows those that are registered as use limited, and then the total, and then a percent. So here you can see that roughly 25 to 28% of the gas fleet is registered as use limited. And so this, again, this was a request of CalCCA and others wanting an idea of what the use limitations on the thermal fleet look like, and how many resources we had under this use limitation. So as you can see here, we have about a quarter of the gas resources that are use limited. So moving to page 6. So the first chart just showed you that sort of how many resources we have that are under use limitations, and the specific use limitations are communicated to us through city tickets, so it's text files. And so looking through those text files, what we found was that the majority of the registered use limitations are driven by air permits. A few resources have physical limitations, and some units have water-related limits for steamers. But again, majority of these use limitations are related to emissions. And so the CAISO believes it would be prudent to factor in these use limitations into the thermal QC methodology and or account for them in the resource's hourly slice profiles, depending on which proposal we end up going with. So I'm going to go to the outage data and then I'll pause for questions. So moving to page 8, this next section, we want to provide some data on what the outage rates look like on the gas fleet. And so this data is pulled from our OMS system, which is our internal reporting where resources provide their outages to the market and for our planning purposes. And so from that data, we extracted all the curtailments of the gas fleet for November 2018 through October 2021. And to derive an hourly outage rate, what we did is we took the hourly outage, takes the maximum of the sum of curtailments within the hour for each resource and applies it to the whole hour in the data set. So what it does is it is in OMS, you can have overlapping outages with different nature of work cards. And so to get sort of the maximum curtailment for the hour, we looked at sort of the maximum overlapping outage for the hour and applied it for the whole hour. So for example, if we had a 100 megawatt Pmax resource, it might have submitted one outage for a 10 megawatt thermal D rate and a 20 megawatt outage for a plant trouble. So in this data set, we would be reporting a 30 megawatt total outage for the hour for that resource. So in order to derive a rate, we took each of these max hourly curtailments and summed them up for the gas fleet and then divided them by the sum of the Pmax for the month. So again, this is the hourly average for the month. And then I also have a cross section that just looks at the 8 p.m. hour. And so it only looks at the sum of curtailments of the gas fleet at hour ending 20 divided by the Pmax of the gas fleet at hour ending 20. And again, this sample only includes gas generators. And we don't distinguish between dispatchable and non-dispatchable. So the extent that a non-dispatchable is registered as a gas fuel type, it would be included in this data set. So on page 9, I provide the monthly average hourly outage rates for the last 3 years. And then the final column is the 3-year average for the month. So some highlights here are that the total 3-year average of the gas fleet has an outage rate of 7.49%. But as you can see in the summer months, we can have significantly higher outage rates ranging between 8.5 to 9.5% on average. And as you can see in 2021, we had higher outage rates overall as well, with June and July being closer to 12 or 13%. And so we can see sort of an increasing trend of outage rates on the gas fleet, but the overall average is 7.5%. So on page 10, I provide a breakdown of the seasonal average hourly outage rate. And so under our Ucap proposal, we're proposing a seasonal approach. And so looking at the off-peak months, which we're designating as November through April, we see a slightly lower outage rate of around 6.91% on average. But then in peak months, which are May through October, we see systematically higher outage rates averaging at 8%. So we do see here a separation in outage rates between off-peak and peak months. I would wager that this difference is likely due to the higher thermal D rates that we observe in summer due to higher ambient temperatures, as well as possibly slightly more plant trouble outages or plant maintenance outages, because a lot of the gas resources get run more often in the summer months and so might be more prone to breakage, especially later in the summer. So that's what's likely driving the difference between these two seasons. So page 11, we provide that same chart of the monthly average hourly outage rates, but only looking at the 8 p.m. hour across the month. I'm trying to get a sense of if there's a difference in the outage rates at sort of that net load peak period. And so as you can see here, there's not too much difference between the 8 p.m. Averages versus all hours in the month. On average, we see a slightly lower outage rate of 7.37%. But again, in months that were high overall, they're also high at this 8 p.m. hour. And we also see similarly higher outage rates in the summer months. So this next slide also provides that seasonal breakdown at 8 p.m. And again, you see a similar difference between off-peak months and peak months, where the off-peak months are around 6.5%, whereas peak months are closer to that 8% mark. And then this last chart just provides more descriptive statistics on the hourly outage rates for all 3 years, broken out by the hour. So as you can see here, the outage rates are pretty consistent across the hours. In the 2 to 5 a.m. timeframe, we have a slightly higher outage rates, closer to 8%. This is driven by a lot of units having overnight noise or air permit restrictions. During the day, they're closer to that 7.5%. And in the RAIM assessment hours, which are usually 17 to 21, we again see a similar 7.5% outage rate. I also provided the standard deviation and the min and max just to give folks a sense of sort of the distribution of these outage rates. And as you can see, in some hours, we can observe outage rates above the 15% planning reserve margin in certain hours. And so outage rates can be quite significant in certain hours. So with that, I will pause to see if there's any questions on use limited and the outage rates. And I also can't see the chat questions. So if there's any that were in the chat, I'm happy if someone would read those out to me. Thanks.
Hey, Bridget. Okay, so there is one question in the chat from Carrie Bentley. So she asks, are these total outages forced and planned or just forced?
Thanks. These are just forced outages.
Okay. And so we have 4 people in the queue. So we'll start with Donald. And then Donald, if you can announce your affiliation. Donald, are you there? Okay, maybe we'll start with Christian. Oh, looks like Donald came on.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, great. So my question is would you consider this a capacity weighted calculation or simple average calculation?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? Your audio is kind of breaking up.
Let's see if I can get sorry, let's take another question. I don't think I have my audio working right.
Okay, Donald, if you want, you can also put it in the chat until you get your audio fixed. But we can go to Christian.
Good morning. This is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. My question is, can the CAISO provide any insight as to whether the remaining OTC gas units have unique and potentially higher than historical forced outage rates, and if that's affecting this data?
So the OTC units would be included in this data, and it could potentially be pulling the averages down slightly, but at the end of the presentation, I provide the Ucap values for 7 example resources broken out by different technology types, and 2 of which are sort of the old steamers, one of which I believe is one of the OTC units, And so they definitely have below average availability, but it's still around 85 to 89% availability. So they're not so dramatically unavailable that it'd be skewing these results, but they are included in the sample.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we'll go to Noah.
Hi, Bridget. Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Was wondering if you could go back to the slide for the monthly forced outage rates. I think slide either 11 or 9. Looking at the data for 2020, I'm noticing that it's like a 6% forced outage rate. I'm trying to understand why that differs from the ISO's RAIN report for 2020, where it seems to be a lot less. It talks looking at a average actual availability of 98.14%.
So this data is in relation to PMAX, and so there are resources that don't sell their full availability, and so to the extent that the outage only affected the PMAX and not what they sold for RA, the RAIN report may not pick up the outages. Also, this monthly data includes all hours, and so there could be instances where, you know, we do know we have more outages overnight for a lot of these air restrictions, and so that could also be or making it look like there's more outages than maybe that other report reported. So I think that probably the two differences are RAIN is really looking in relation to the capacity that was sold as RA, whereas this data is looking at the outages in relation to PMAX of the unit and not taking into account what was sold for RA or not. So this is just, again, that raw outage data. And so there could be resources, again, that aren't selling their full PMAX. And so the outage may not have affected their RA availability. And then again, we're just looking at more hours. And so you're picking up different outages than what is in the RAIN report because it only looks at a subset of hours.
Is there any relationship to the data here with regards to being RAIN exempt versus non-RAIN exempt?
So this includes all outages. So I didn't separate out any of the nature of work cards. So yes, there are forced outages that are RAIN exempt that are included in this analysis. So that could be another reason that the rates are different.
I'm wondering whether or not it'd be useful to identify the impact of the RAIN exempt outages on this data set so that you can see whether or not, you know, RAIN sort of is doing its job on trying to ensure sort of reliability, to the extent that if you look at the September data, what you have here is around 10.3% of forced outage rate. The September 2020 data shows 96.9% availability. This seems to be, you know, about a 3 or 4% difference there. Trying to see if that would drag down that or have that impact on your data. And then finally, do you envision or think about changing it to things to Ucap would have a 1-for-1 impact to the planning reserve margin?
So is your question, if we had Ucap, then we could essentially take out like 7.5% out of the PRM? Is that your question?
Yeah, the full 7.5, because the PRM isn't explicit for thermal resources, and Ucap would only be applied to thermal resources, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that would be up for discussion. And so I do think the point of Ucap is you can take some portion of the forced outage rates out of the PRM. And so to the extent that other methodologies beyond Ucap, so say exceedance, to the degree that we think it does a reasonable job of accounting for forced outages as well as differences in output due to the wind and solar output due to weather, I think we could have more of a 1-for-1 out of the PRM. So I think that's kind of a discussion. So it's, yes, to the extent that I think the upfront resource counting methodologies, whether it's Ucap or exceedance, accounts for forced outages, then you don't need to include those in the PRM. But if we wanted to have a little bit more cushion because not all resources are on a Ucap or don't include forced outages, then you may want to include 1 or 2% or whatever percentage point to give yourself sort of insurance to cover other outages.
Great, thanks.
Okay, next we have Kathleen.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks so much for this, Bridget. Noah and Carrie asked a couple of my questions already, but I do have one more I wanted to raise and kind of talk a little bit about, and that is whether I'm assuming that the type of outages that fit into, and I'll kind of see this back to some of the proposals in at least the 2-slice proposal, where we've separated forced outage risk from substitution risk. So from planned outage without substitution, which can result in a plan to forced, has its own outage rate kind of concept in our proposal, versus outages that couldn't be anticipated that occur in the forced timeframe are under a forced outage rate. Can you confirm for me that starting with the June 1 implementation of 2021, that your sample set would have included those planned to forced?
Yes. So that might also explain the slightly higher rates in 2021 is the change in the POSO rules where planned outages can no longer be extended without substitution. So that is partially driving some of the higher rates in 2020.
I think that's really helpful and something that would be, illustrated for this group as we kind of keep talking about this idea of having the 2 separate categories of outage rates. If you could update your analysis and separate out the outages that have a nature work type with plant maintenance, at least I think that's a good proxy for the plan to force ones that might be in there, and kind of give us a sense of what that would be on a percent basis separate from forced. Because even if we go down the path of, thinking about a deterministic rather than a probabilistic approach, I think that would be informative for this group if we think about them as 2 separate things.
Thanks for that feedback.
Yeah, no, thank you. Really great.
Okay, Carrie, before we go to you, I'll go to Donald again since he's been waiting patiently. I want to see if his audio is fixed.
Do you hear me?
Yes, that sounds better.
That sounds better. Fantastic. I called in on my phone, and so I think that was my phone is buried in one of the numbers at the bottom. All right. Well, so I put it in chat too. Also, the question is, can we break this out between combined cycle and combustion turbine? Those are, I think, very different outage rates, and would, I think, inform how we do a Ucap calculation. CCs versus combustion turbines versus cogen have very different outage rates. And so I just wanted to see if you had that broken down by unit type. That I think was my question. I think that was my question.
Yeah, so again, at the end of the presentation, I have a couple resource examples that are broken out by tech type. But for this outage data, I don't actually have the technology type. I'd have to do an additional crosswalk with master file data. And so we haven't done that yet. But in the example resources, you do see that there is sort of a systematic difference across technology type. And so here, this again is just providing the average across all technologies. And so, yes, I think as you'll see in energy division using gas data, there is sort of a systematic difference in technology types. But under Ucap, since it is resource specific, you'd be picking up those unique specific outage rates. Folks a sense of sort of that. all the gas generators, just as sort of a benchmark to compare at the end. Is this resource? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Wait, no, sorry. This is Carrie Bentley with Gridwell Consulting. I was wondering if you broke this down by nature of work categories. In both the Gridwell proposal and in PG&E's, we were debating whether to just discount by ambient D rate due to temp or whether it would be worth it to move to full Ucap. And I don't really see a breakdown in your presentation. So I'm wondering if you have that data or you can give any color for us.
Yes. So I have looked at it by nature of work card, but there was the original slides I put together, there were some errors in the denominator. And so I didn't have time to update those in order to include this in this presentation. But kind of looking at the rates, I will say were about 3%, I want to say. And then the plant trouble, plant maintenance outages were more than that. So I can try to update those files and possibly include those in our informal comments or figure out a way to kind of put that in the proceeding. But I will say that like plant trouble, plant maintenance were larger than just the thermal D rates.
That's really helpful. You know, what would be great is if you could update this presentation and recirculate that. I know that's allowed within this. And if it was just, you know, a last minute thing, to me anyway, that'd be more helpful than informal comments because our proposal chapters are due to PG&E at the same time as the informal comments. So I won't be able to use that in the official report unless we get the data earlier. And then yeah, just another additional request, if at all possible, that plant maintenance, is that the same as planned to forced outages? And if not, could you include that data as well of what's planned to forced? Because I think that would also inform the proposal.
I can definitely give you the breakdown of plant maintenance. It'll be a little difficult to parse out the planned to forced. So I don't have an easy way of identifying that because this is millions of data lines. And so in order to kind of catch the planned to forced, you'd have to figure out like the timing of the plan and does it turn into a forced. So I don't think I would easily be able to get that, but I can at least give you the sort of historic look at like the plant maintenance. And, you know, in 2021, as Kathleen, you know, pointed out, we did change the POSO rule where we did, starting in June, disallow the extension of plant outages without substitutions. And so kind of maybe the historic rate differences between 2021 and 2022 and 2019 might give you kind of a sense of how big the historic planned to forced might be, because historically we've just sort of allowed it to continue on as a planned outage.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Bridget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Bridget, you just had one last question in the chat on slide 13. It looks like it's from Kyle. He asked, referencing the maximum outage rates can exceed 15%. PRM in certain hours, is that the PRM for the full fleet or just the thermal resources?
So obviously the 15% covers all resources, but because thermals make up such a large proportion of the fleet, especially at the like hour after the solar ends, looking at the what a 15% planning reserve margin looks at in terms of megawatts of the total percentage. I do think that an outage rate on the thermal fleet of 18 to 19% would take up the majority of your planning reserve margin. And it definitely extends beyond what is currently accounted for in planned outages. So I definitely think you run the risk of not having enough reserve margin for the 6% of the contingency reserves. So I definitely think there are hours where the planning reserve margin is not sufficient if the thermal fleet is this unavailable.
Okay, and Kyle, this is the note taker. You're with CalPA?
Sorry, yes, Cal Advocates.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, no other questions, Bridget.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move on to looking at the CAISO's proposal for unforced capacity evaluation methodology. And so a lot of these slides are similar to what we had presented on back in October in the resource counting workshop. But just in case folks weren't in those workshops, wanted to provide another kind of probably fairly quick run through of the methodology. And then at the end, I'll also present the data that helps support this proposal. So moving to page 15, an unforced capacity construct ensures resources capacity values reflect their availability. And so an unforced capacity evaluation promotes the procurement of the most dependable and reliable resources upfront by accounting for their historic unavailability in their capacity values. So the current PRM, forced outage substitution rules, and RAIM have proven inadequate to replace capacity on forced outages in the forced timeframe. And so moving to a Ucab construct would allow the ISO to eliminate complicated and ineffective forced outage substitution rules. Another advantage of Ucap is that it dynamically changes with the fleet's forced outage rate. So relying solely on the PRM, which has historically been a static value, may lead to the over or under procurement if future outage rates change. And so the PRM would only need to cover operating reserves and forecast error to the extent that the resources counting sufficiently accounted for forced outages. So as we pointed out, Ucap right now is really only being proposed for thermal and storage resources. And so to the extent that the other resource counting methodologies did or did not cover forced outage rates, you may still want to include a few percentage points of forced outage rates in the PRM, but you could take out a good chunk of it. So moving to page 16, seasonal availability factor methodology can be used to determine Ucap values. And so the CAISO continues to recommend using a seasonal average availability factor based approach for Ucap determinations during the tightest system conditions by looking at the hourly RA supply cushion. And resource availability factors incorporate historic force and urgent outages to determine the resource's expected future availability and contributions to reliability. And again, we think this methodology is best used for dispatchable thermal resources and could be applied to storage resources as well. So looking at page 17, resource availability can be calculated on a seasonal basis on tight RA supply cushion hours. So this approach considers different impacts of availability during seasons across the year to better reflect unit reliability. So as you saw in the prior slides, we did see a difference in outage rates between off-peak and peak months. And so looking at Ucap values under a similar seasonal approach would better account for this seasonal difference. A low RA supply cushion indicates the system has fewer assets available to react to unexpected outages or load increases, and indicates a high real-time system resource adequacy risk. And so this method captures how tight the system would be if we only had the RA fleet to rely on. And so in this assessment, we make no assumptions about the availability of economic energy, because with tightening conditions across the West, this may no longer be a viable assumption, or we think is prudent in the design of an RA program, which is meant to cover your entire needs if you only had your RA program to rely on. So page 18, we provide the formula for how we're going to calculate this and identify the tightest RA supply cushion hours. So the RA supply cushion is measured as the daily shown RA, excluding wind and solar, netting out planned outages, opportunity outages, urgent and forced outages, net load, and contingency reserves. So what the RA supply cushion represents is how much RA megawatts are left over after we take into account outages, serving net demand, and covering contingency reserves. And here, contingency reserves covers reg up, spin, and non-spin reserves. Everything is measured in megawatts, and then all inputs are averaged across the hour to produce an hourly RA supply cushion measure. So looking at page 19, the CPUC recommends looking at forced outage rates under a subset of hours that represent the hours of greatest RA supply risk. So the advantages of using this kind of approach is that it penalizes resources for being on outage when the grid really needed them. These assessment hours can fall at any point in the day, and thus resources are always incentivized to be available. So unlike rain today, where the hours are known in advance, Ucap assessment hours are only known in retrospect, and so resources will not know whether this day or this hour is a Ucap assessment hour. And the idea is that they'd be more incentivized to do proper maintenance to make sure that they're always available to keep their Ucap values high. It's simpler than an E4D methodology and will allow the ISO to utilize our OMS rather than GAS data. But it is similar in that E4D tries to assess the effective forced outage rate when the unit was in demand. And so looking at the RA supply cushion is our way of assessing whether the unit was in demand. Because if we have a lot of extra resources, then one unit tripping offline is less impactful when we have 20,000 extra megawatts versus when we're in negative RA supply cushion periods or down to 1,000 or 2,000 megawatts of supply cushion. Looking at a percent of hours provides consistency across the evaluation periods and provides more predictable risk of any one outage on a resource's capacity value. So in prior proposals, we had considered looking at designating a specific RA supply cushion cutoff point. So anytime the hours fell below 2,000 megawatts, would we assess Ucap? But under that methodology, you run the risk of having different sample sizes in each year and also no guarantee that you would have hours to look at. And so by looking at a percent of hours, you provide this consistency across the evaluation period, and then having predictable risk of, I know for certain that this number of hours will be looked at. And so an outage in any one of those hours has the same impact on the resource's Ucap value year over year. And so the data at the end also shows that the observations will cover a majority of days and concentrates the Ucap assessment hours in the peak and net load period currently, and is a sufficiently large sample size to produce robust averages. So again, the seasons we select for Ucap could be aligned with slice of day. And so we've seemed to have moved away from a seasonal approach to slice of day, but we still think it's prudent to maintain a seasonal Ucap value, again, because we do see differences in the outage rates across the different seasons. And so we're continuing to propose that the peak months be May through October, and then off-peak months November through April. And so under the SCE proposal, resources would have the same Ucap value in each month of the season, and then potentially the same value in all hourly slices. So to the extent that we think that Ucap does a good enough job of capturing the use limitations, then the resource could have, again, the same Ucap value in all 24 slices. But to the extent that we wanted the hourly slices to account for use limitations, we could take them out of the Ucap and just put them in the hourly slice values. So for instance, those units that have those overnight noise restrictions who are always unavailable between like 2 and 5 would have a 0 in those hours, and then their Ucap value wouldn't look at those outages and it would just be accounting for any other thermal derates or outages in other hours. Under the two-slice proposal, again, resources would have the same Ucap value in each month of the season, and would also have the same value at peak and net load peak slice. So this chart provides the list of existing nature of work categories for forced outages and whether or not they would be included in Ucap. And so right now we're including majority of nature of work cards and providing exemptions for new generator test energy, transmission induced outages, and technical limitations not in the market model. And then unit testing is excluded if it's initiated by the CAISO, but if it's initiated by the resource, then it is included in Ucap. And so this is a much more exhaustive list than what is currently included in RAIM. So there are a number of RAIM exempt outages that are actually included in Ucap. So next,
Bridget, we have 3 people in the queue. Did you want to go through these slides, these set of slides first, or did you want to take those questions?
I think it'd be helpful just for time just to get through all of it, and then at the end have a more holistic Q&A.
Okay, that works.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so this next slide provides a summary of the steps we do to actually calculate the Ucap values. And then I provide the actual formulas so people can see how this is working out. So first step is to determine the Ucap assessment hours by identifying which hours fall into the top, whatever threshold we pick of tightest RA supply cushion hours for each season. And then for each of those Ucap assessment hours, we determine the hourly unavailability factor by looking at the forced and urgent outages each Ucap assessment hour over the Pmax of the resource. Then we determine the seasonal average availability factors using 1 minus the average hourly unavailability factors for each season for each of the prior years. So again, by subtracting it from 1, then you convert it from an unavailability measure to an availability measure. We're proposing to look at Ucap using 3 years of historic data and then weighting the most recent years more heavily. So we're proposing to weight the first year by 45%, the second year by 35%, and the last year by, it's actually 20%, that's a typo. And then apply the weighted seasonal average availability factors for each season to the deliverable capacity to determine the monthly NQC values for each of the resources. So again, here we're providing the formulas. So the hourly unavailability factor is the total forced and urgent outage impacts on the resource for the hour divided by its Pmax. The next step is to look at the seasonal average availability factor. So again, we take the total unavailability factor for that season divided by the number of observation hours, subtracted from 1, and that gets you your seasonal average availability factor. And then for each of the 3 years, we provide this weighting scheme with the idea being that the most recent data should be weighed more heavily. So that way, if the resource does do maintenance in that year and it happened to have a really bad Ucap year, the impact of that year would be diminishing over time and eventually roll off. So the extent that you had a bad outage year, but you did maintenance to prevent it in the future, again, the impact of that bad outage year would be diminishing over time. And then again, finally, to get your final Ucap NQC value, you would multiply this weighted seasonal average availability factor in each of the season to the deliverable capacity of the resource. And so since we are proposing that this Ucap methodology could be used for storage resources, we know that there's going to be a lot of new resources coming online. We don't expect there to be many new thermal resources, but to the extent that there are, then we proposed a different weighting scheme for how we could derive Ucap values for resources that don't have 3 years of historic outage rates. And so basically what we're doing is proposing a different weighting scheme where as we get more and more of the resource's historic performance, then we'd eventually get to the final weighting scheme. So for that first year, before we have operational data, we're proposing that the resource's Ucab value would be the same as their deliverable capacity. And then that next year, that first year of forced outage data would be weighted 70%, and then 30% would be weighted on the deliverable capacity. And then the year 2, we'd weight it 55, 45, and 0 for the deliverable capacity. And then by year 3, we would have 3 years of data. And again, you'd get to that 45, 35, 20 weighting scheme. So basically for new resources, we had initially proposed a class average approach, but we heard a lot from the storage community that storage resources can be very different across tech types, and there's going to be new formulas and chemistries or technologies coming online. And so they preferred less of a class average approach and more of using the resources' own data to the extent possible. And so we thought offering a different weighting scheme could be a way to accommodate that request. And then again, we think that the unforced capacity evaluation can be incorporated into the NQC process. And so today the CAISO conducts a 2-step process to assess resources QCs that would assess the resources deliverability and availability. So for step 1, we would conduct the resources deliverability assessment and adjust the QC values for deliverability, which would create the deliverable capacity or the DQC for the resource. And then we would apply the non-availability factor to the DQC, which would result in the final NQC value of the resource under a Ucap construct. And so capacity values would still be expressed in terms of NQC, which address stakeholder concerns around existing contracts. But the must offer obligation would be in terms of the deliverable capacity. And so this is what creates the natural pool of substitute capacity, is that if the thermal fleet is only valued at their availability factor qualifying capacity, but are bidding in above that to their full deliverable capacity, then that delta between what their Ucap value is and what their deliverable capacity is what creates that extra pool of megawatts that's being offered into the market that can cover any outages that may occur in the real time. So I'm going to get to the data because I think that'll make it more sense, and then I'll stop for questions. So this first chart shows the percentile distribution of the RA supply cushion for each of the 6 seasons over the last 3 years. And so this gives you a sense of the potential different cutoff points we would use for assessing forced outage rates. And so in the past, the CAISO has recommended looking at the top 20% of RA supply cushion hours, but there was some debate whether 15 or 10 would be more reasonable measure. And so we provide some data on how these different sampling frames would produce different Ucap values. And so one thing to keep in mind is that while the exact cutoff of what the RA supply cushion is year over year may be slightly different, what's important to keep in mind, and one of the advantages of this percentile approach is that it will always be the top 20% of tightest RA supply cushions for that year. And so even though, you know, in 2018, 2019, the 20% cutoff was at 2,900 megawatts, and then the next year it was closer to 4,000 or 5,000, these hours would still be the top 20% of tightest supply conditions for that sample of data. Here also a negative number indicates that we didn't have enough RA to cover net load, outages, and demand. However, as long as it wasn't August 2020, the CAISO never dropped load. And so we know in real conditions that there are economic energy or additional imports that the CAISO uses to keep the lights on. But again, for this RA assessment, we think it's prudent to just look at system conditions if we only had the RA fleet to rely on. So then in the appendix, I provide the full breakdown of Ucab assessment hours broken out by operating hour, as well as number of Ucab hours in a day distributions. But this table just provides a sort of a summary of how the different sampling frames impact what hours are included in the sample. And so for a top 20% sample, we're looking at just over 800 hours. For top 15%, you're looking at, 650. At 10%, you're looking at 440, et cetera. So again, the number of hours decreases obviously as the percentile goes down. And what this different sampling frames seem to do is that it seems to concentrate the number of Ucab assessment hours in that hour 17 to 22, which we think of as our peak and net load peak period. So to the extent that you have a smaller and smaller sample size, you're getting more concentration in what we typically think of as the RAIM assessment hours a day. And you're getting less observations outside of those hours. And then you're also covering less percent of days. So we think that top 20, top 15 does a good job of balancing, concentrating hours, Ucab assessment hours in periods that you would think you would want to observe them during that peak hour. But the top 20%, if you look in the appendix, you get more concentration in that morning ramp period. And to the extent that resources are unavailable in the morning, looking at a top 20% would get you our Ucap value that can assess that availability in those different hours. Also, by covering 84% of the days, you have a greater chance that any day is going to be a Ucap assessment day, and so you want to make sure you're not on outage. So again, we think top 20%, top 15% is probably the right sampling frame to balance out, waiting the hours where the resources was really needed, while also providing kind of a robust sample. So then this next slide provides sort of a step-by-step breakdown. So here we're looking at the outage rates for the Ucab assessment hours under the top 20% sample. And so here, what I did is I looked at all the curtailments on all of the gas fleet in these Ucab assessment hours, and then divided it over the total 30,000 megawatts. And so here you can see in the peak months, we had a weighted seasonal average availability factor of 0.914. So you can think of this as the storage fleet, or sorry, the gas fleet being 91% available in peak months. And then for off-peak months, they were 93% available. And then what you would do is you'd multiply the Pmax by these to get the final NQC value. So here you can kind of see like what the megawatt impact would be of moving to Ucap. And then lastly, I have provided individual resource specific data on looking at 2 combined cycles, 2 steamers, 1 CT unit, 2 peakers, and then provide the total gas fleet, and then looked at it across 5 different sampling frames. So top 20% of hours, top 15%, top 10, top 5, top 1, just so you can get a sense of how Ucap values might be sensitive to sample size. And so as you can see, top 20, top 10%, there's not that much difference in the outage rates. Whereas you look at top 5, top 1%, again, the outage rates can be significantly different. So what I hope this table illustrates as one of the advantages of Ucap is that it is resource specific. And so it provides you more upfront information on the reliability of the unit. And so we think this would give load serving entities more information about which would be the best resource to contract with. And then also, as we transition the fleet away from thermal resources and are starting to make more retirement decisions, Ucap can provide a lot of information about which unit should I keep around. So for instance, if I was trying to decide which peaker I wanted to contract with, here I could see that peaker 1 is only available about 88% of the time in the off-peak months, where this peaker 2 is available 95% of the time. I'd be more likely to want to contract with peaker 2. Additionally, if I was trying to make a decision about which of these units to retire, I would obviously want to keep around the unit that had the higher availability. And so that's one of the advantages of Ucap, is providing more of that transparency around how reliable is this unit, which would I rather contract with, and then which one do I want to retire first. And then you can also use the total gas fleet, again, as sort of an average benchmark to see, is this resource performing above average or below average, as you're sort of parsing through these. So one other thing I want to note is, so for example, the C2 unit, I know it has, it's use limited, and so it has noise restrictions at night. And so I know it always has an outage between 2 and 5 in the morning every day. But as you can see here, its availability is still relatively high at 95 or 92%. And so it's likely that the sampling frame isn't picking up those overnight outages. And so if we were looking at SCE's proposal, we may want to think about the fact that we might want to, rather than looking at those outages through Ucap, we might want to include it in that hourly energy profiles that are being used in the showings. And then, we could consider taking out those outages from Ucap. So with that, I know that was a lot of information, so I will stop for questions.
Okay, first in the queue, we have Carrie.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with Goodwill Consulting. I first just wanted to clarify something on page 20 that Bridget was explaining how it could work under the Goodwill Vistra proposal, and be clear that we still haven't decided whether to actually put in the Ucap into the description of our proposal yet. And so in that vein, part of our decision is going to be something that I've said a couple times, and that's the question of whether historical outages are a good predictor of future outages. In my mind, you could put the outage rates either in the planning reserve margin and the requirement, or you could put it in the resource value to reduce each individual resource. And so if for an individual resource, Ucap is a good predictor of future availability, I think Ucap makes sense. But if Ucap is a poor predictor of individual resource availability, then I think it would be really inefficient to put it in the resource value. And my concern with this assessment is it still doesn't tell me whether for any individual resource, whether Ucap is a good predictor or not. And then if you go to slide 9, I'm really worried that it's not a good predictor, because slide 9 seems to say that, let's look at July. In slide 9, your outage rate goes from 5.5% to 13%. And that seems to tell me that historical forced outages are not a good predictor of future forced outages. So I'm wondering, Bridget, is there additional analysis you could provide on the resource level, or can you maybe just qualify why you think Ucap's a good idea if the data is showing in aggregate that historical outages aren't a good predictor of future forced outages?
Well, I think this is a point that you and I just disagree on. But where I think you have to compare it to is that whether you put it in the PRM or whether you put it in Ucap, you're always going to be some degree of wrong. And it's who gets you closer to being right more often. So right now for the PRM, you have a static value. Say you put it at 5% or 5, 6, 7%. In June, you'd still be wrong.
We're not proposing that anymore. Now we're going to do a loss of load expectation analysis every year. But so when we compare, I agree.
historic outages. So how do you know what you should predict on if you don't look at the past? And so who's to say that that 13% in June will be the same next June? And so
right, but if you put it in
about,
oh, go ahead, Bridget, sorry.
So stats is always going to be slightly wrong. And so it's about like reducing, like what is the way to get the least amount of errors? And so I think, you know, there always is going to be some degree of randomness to outages, but to the extent that they're not, the advantages of doing Ucap is that putting it all up in the PRM, if I'm looking at contracting with resources, I have no idea which, if I'm comparing resources, which of these is going to be above the PRM performance or below the PRM performance. If I'm going to retire a unit, I have no idea which of these should I keep on. So I think especially for thermals, what I think is a key advantage of Ucap and why we'd want to do an individual assessment is that right now we're assuming this resource should be valid at Pmax. We're going to be 100% wrong majority of the hours. Ucap gets you closer to, all right, I'm going to assess you at, say, you're 93% available. So I'm assuming that 7% of the time you're going to have some degree of outage. Derating that resource at 7% gets me closer to being right more often of guessing what the resource's availability is than my current prediction of 100%. So
yeah, I think where we disagree is the intersection between statistics and the actual energy market. So I agree with you that in average across all resources, you'll be more right with Ucap. Where I disagree with you fundamentally that it's appropriate to penalize a resource, an individual resource at that rate, if there's no evidence that their historic outage actually will predict their future outage. And so I think that predictable or correlated outages certainly should be in the resource value. Like I absolutely think ambient D rates due to temp should reduce RA value for gas, right? And anything you could show me that's predictable from year to year, I'll agree with you, should absolutely reduce it. But I don't think it's appropriate to reduce a resource's RA value. And I think it's actually more inefficient for the market if you inappropriately discount them. And that's because if you discount a resource, let's say by 50%, but they're actually 100% available, and then another resource looks like they're closer to 100% available, but they're only 50% available, and you have that flip year to year, you're going to end up overpaying for RA. So I don't think we're disagreeing about statistics. I just want you to show me that, you know, about within a margin of error that a resource's forced outages about equal their future outages.
I mean, Ucap is industry practice, so all other ISOs, RTOs do Ucap, and so...
And they've demonstrated what I've asked. If you go to PJM's presentations, they've showed that exact analysis that I'm asking for. And I think that's needed to go to FERC and say it's just unreasonable.
Okay.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, next is Christian.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. My question is on page 22. Given the high proportion of suggested assessment hours that are gross peak to net peak hours, on page 22, it seems to me there is potentially a premise here about deliverability across slices. And I'll acknowledge, I think, Bridget, you specifically mentioned that Ucap could account for availability variation across hours, looking at those environmental restrictions, for example, in the early hours. But what about deliverability variation? So the question is it correct that if we're looking at deliverability and those assumptions are driven by the gross and net peak constraints, is it fair to make that assumption that deliverability, those megawatts, are deliverable across slices? And if not, how does the CAISO propose to account for deliverability variation across slices?
So right now, We haven't contemplated moving a deliverability assessment beyond what we currently do today, which is that peak assessment. And then we have also started looking at off-peak deliverability. And so we'd have to open up another stakeholder process to contemplate what deliverability studies would look like beyond those 2 assessment periods. We think it's not necessarily the right direction to move to looking at deliverability across all hours, or to have resources have different deliverability statuses in different hours. And so we think that would further complicate the transactability of the RA program, and may not be necessary because the markets do a sufficient enough job of dispatching the resources, utilizing the transmission constraints. So for the upfront planning, we think it's still prudent that as long as the resource is deliverable at peak, then the markets can figure out how to optimize the fleet in these other conditions. So Ucap, again, is assuming if you're deliverable on peak, you're deliverable in all the other hours. And so we don't do a separate deliverability assessment. And so here, when I say availability, I mean availability because you're not on outage, not necessarily if your deliverability is impacted. Because again, we only study it at the peak.
Okay, next we have Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. I just wanted some clarification in your UCAP proposal. The combustion turbine that has, environmental restrictions either due to emissions, or I think you mentioned a case where they have noise limitations of hour factors. Did that enter into the calculation, or did it not? You went a little bit quick.
So it doesn't really. So this appendix slide shows you on page 36, it shows you the breakdown of the operating hour and then how many UCAP assessment hours are at that operating hour for the assessment period. So as you can see here in the peak months, for hours 2 to 5, we only have about 10 to 15 UCAP assessment hours in this overnight period, out of the, probably hundreds there are at this period. And so under the sampling frame, you only observe a few observations of that overnight restriction. And so the impact of those outages, because they don't happen during tight RA supply cushion hours, they don't really impact the resource's UCAP value. And so, but if we're moving to a 24 slice proposal, it may be better to treat those kind of outages in the hourly profiles. If we know it's something that's very, it's a permit, it's always going to be off. And so their availability is going to be 0 in those hours. Because this methodology doesn't pick up all those hours, it may overcount the resource in those hours. And so it might be more prudent to account for those kinds of use limitations through the hourly profile of the resource under SC's proposal, and not include it in the UCAP value, and UCAP just picking up like thermal D rates, the plant trouble outages, et cetera.
Okay, so the number of observations you said in the peak months, if it, like you said the 2 to 5, then those basically get sort of a weighting value. Okay, that helps. And then another question I had, and I just again for clarity, if a unit had sort of a unit overhaul, planned unit overhaul in a year, that doesn't affect their future UCAP, or did it?
So if they had a major upgrade that they think is going to increase their availability, we don't do a whole new assessment of the resource. But what we did to try to balance that is we weight later years less heavily. So if they did a major maintenance and then that next year, that data would be weighted 45% of their total Ucab value. And so they're through weighting it less over time, then to the extent that those upgrades actually did increase their performance, then we would start to pick those up in future Ucap values. So we aren't proposing to do a reassessment of the resource because it would be hard to really know if they actually did do, radically did change the outage rates. And so basically we're trying to accommodate that through the weighting scheme by weighting the better data more recently, more heavily, and then to the extent that their past performance is changing because of this maintenance, then again, the resources, that data would roll off after 3 years. And again, would get less impactful year over year.
Why not treat it similar to what you're proposing for like a new resource? If it's like a major overhaul.
We hadn't contemplated that. I think if stakeholders are really advocate for that, that's something we could consider doing. But I think we'd have to put some rules around what qualifies as a major maintenance overhaul to say that this really is a new resource. So we could consider it, but again, I think we'd want to put in clear upfront requirements before we'd allow the resource to be treated that way.
Fair enough. I mean, because, if a merchant's going to look at whether it makes sense to do an overhaul, how, if it doesn't affect their future performance for another, the full impact for another 3 years, that's going to enter into their decision on whether they do an overhaul or not. But, if the overhaul makes it look much more like a new resource and more reliable, I think you would want that to get to when they're looking at whether they make these decisions to do the investment, that they're seeing the benefit immediately. Because otherwise, when they start applying discount factors, you don't want to discourage investment to improve reliability.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might address, I think it was some of Carrie Bentley's concerns as well. So.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we could consider. And then, like I said, I think as long as we put in clear guidelines up front about what kinds of major maintenance would qualify for you to be treated as a new resource, I think the CAISO could potentially support that.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. How many more callers do we have in the queue?
We have about 3 more and 9 more minutes for your section. So next we have Kathleen.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks, Bridget, for all this. I just had a couple of reflections that I wanted to share with you as you think through this. The first is that, and just kind of echo some of what Carrie said, and I heard what you said, and I agree with a lot of what you said as well. I think that, but I would say, I think that the very important thing is what type of driver are we talking about? And it is, and I'll speak on behalf of myself, it is my personal belief that if the risks are unpredictable and they are, or not, if the risks could occur in a way that they could occur in many different scenarios, that is why we think that a loss of load expectation study that includes probabilistic scenarios that can reflect the range of risks around outages within an LOLE is the best, most statistically robust way to get to what the amount of the fleet is needed in order to mitigate the risk of loss of load. I think an important reason that works, and just to highlight this, is that the reason that that is okay in the LOLE driving the PRM is that those outages, there's a ton of scenarios, they could be some of them could be overlapping, but they're not generally expected to be simultaneously occurring. So if you think about procuring the substitute capacity up front, through the PRM for those types of outages, I think that is really reasonable. Now, like Carrie said, for the ambience, that is more akin to solar operating profiles, wind operating profiles. There is a profile that we know has a predictable shape that can be forecasted and used, and that could be used. And here's my question for you. Our view is that could be used in either an effective load carrying capability study, similarly to those types of resources, showing the shape, identifying that ELCC would be testing, right, for the loss of load probability hours rather than from some type of assumption or like you're proposing, as well as in like a Ucap light approach. Can you just confirm for me that you have the same view that it could be done in either? It's just kind of preferences and pros and cons for the ambience.
So yeah, I mean, the ambient D rates, you could just do looking at like what historically for the resource, or build out some sort of profile. I think ELCC, again, you'd have to do it on a tech type. So you get sort of a resource class average. So yes, you'd be able to like distinguish between a CT versus a steamer versus combined cycle, and what their contributions to reliability would be. But through ELCC, you wouldn't necessarily know, okay, of this combined cycles, which is the most reliable. ELCC would just give you the class average. So you just kind of know, again, differences across tech type. You wouldn't necessarily know individual plant performance. Is this one better maintained than the other? ELCC wouldn't give you that kind of information. So I think that's, again, that's I see as like the chief advantage of Ucap is that individual resource specific assessment. I do think there are other ways to account for outages and the fact that, you know, this assumption that the resource is 100% available all the time, that we are currently seeing around normal.
Bridget, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I apologize. I just wanted to let you know that there is a performance adjustment approach that ELCC frameworks use where you can request a resource-specific adjustment to the ELCC class based on historical behavior. So I did want to just note that it is something that can still be incorporated into the ELCC approach. Not necessarily recommending ELCC for thermals, because I think often Ucap or Ucap Lite is chosen because it is a Ucap Lite might be simpler, but I did want to note it's still feasible. The other thing I wanted to kind of be very transparent about is that this is not a traditional Ucap, and that I think there are like two things that Vistra believes has to happen if everything switches from considering kind of the status quo of PMAX or an ELCC to a Ucap. The only way that this is really workable is if two things occur. The first is that the CAISO would need to get rid of 100% POSO rules because it would now be being accounted for in the counting rules of those resources. We just talked about plan to forced earlier today. And the second is that the methodology needs to include all hours, and it can't, and it needs to be focused on a traditional E4D that the industry has faith in. And so if those two things can be done in this venue and kind of looked into, or at least, I think that would be a benefit and something we're willing to explore, even though our preference is to maintain a PMAX or Ucap Lite. Thank you.
Okay, so we're running short on time. So unfortunately, I'm happy to answer any more questions via chat or at the end. But we do have one more slide that we wanted to go over. We only have 3 minutes left. So sorry to everybody else that's in the queue. Again, if you put your questions in the chat, I can try to answer them in the next presentation, or I'll be on for the rest of the day. And so at the Q&A at the end, we can also revisit Ucap. So with that, I'll hand it over to Partha for this last slide.
No, thanks, Bridget. Could you pull it up by chance?
It should be on
It's
already.
on the screen. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't see it. I'm working off Teams on my phone, so that maybe that's the problem. So yeah, really appreciate it. And I'll just all sort of just set expectations. 3 minutes probably is not enough time for this discussion, but I was really happy to see that both Calpine and SCE had offered to present on very related topics later today, in which we can get more into the details. So really, this is just sort of at a high level discussing some of the areas that we're considering scoping out as a part of an initiative to help sort of align with and harmonize the PUC's program and the CAISO's programs. And so these are basically our initial questions, just in terms of what areas might we change and might not we might what we want to change, what we might not want to change, what data would be required, what processes and systems. The really key questions we had were really around how would this slice a day work with the sort of the 4 areas listed below: the must offer obligations and bid insertion rules, the outage replacement rules, the various CPM processes, including like the validation processes, the triggers and cost allocation, and as well as was discussed earlier, the interconnection study input and assumptions. We really haven't come to concrete solutions to basically how either the Gridwell or the SCE's proposals might work under these constructs, but those are really sort of key questions that we're trying to look at, and we'd like to sort of get feedback earlier in terms of questions that you all have, and that's why I was really happy to hear that both Calpine and SCE had sort of jumped in to help with those discussions. So, the last item listed on the slide that we indicate is that one other consideration that we have is certainly how would Slice a Day work along with other LRA programs in CAISO, and how can we have those sort of all work seamlessly to achieve the results we're looking for. So I'll stop there, but certainly happy to answer questions now, or probably more appropriately take questions now that you all have. But it seems like we might want to move on to the next presentation and discuss this more when Calpine and SCE are talking later this afternoon.
Yeah, Parth, I think we'll hold the questions for now, and then we'll move to Energy Division's presentation, and then hopefully address the others in the Q&A session.
Yep, that sounds perfect. Thanks, Rat. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so I think we can hand it over. I believe Donald Brooks will be presenting.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm gonna just open the share tray. And here's the slides that I've got. Slide mode there. Turbine production cost modeling results. We'll call it that. Unit outage rates resulting from modeling that we're doing for 2024. And I was just asked to share outage rates from our model to compare to outage rates that the ISO shared for their Ucap approach, and so that's what I did. There it is. The purpose is to present outage rates. Certain categories resulting from input test data. So we entered data into Servum, ran the model, and then based on which units were dispatched and what actually happened in the model, you get sort of an output. So if units weren't turned on or units weren't used and never encountered outages, you might not have the same level of E4 and E4D. So that's what I'm saying here. Benchmarking against CAISO outage data for use in the RA proceeding, background and summary of unit outage rates, and outage rates resulting from our model for the 2024 study here. Is everybody seeing the slides?
Yes.
See the slide, but it looks like a few people are having a difficult time hearing you.
Oh, difficult time hearing me.
If you speak up and clearly.
Okay, I'll try. outage data, generally based on NERC's GADS data. Generator owner in NERC is required to electronically submit forced and maintenance data, including records of individual outages broken down by cause, category, and part of the plant. Outages, individual outage records are aggregated and analyzed to produce a variety of statistics that are eventually used in system reliability studies, including maintenance rate, E4, E4D, startup probabilities, other kinds of data. E4 data is entered into Servum as a distribution. We make a distribution out of the GADS data, a distribution of time to fail and time to repair values. And Servum stochastically draws from a distribution when dispatching the unit. ISO has proposed to use OMS outage data in NQC calculations. Some resource types may have NQC calculations that are not based on a Ucap approach. Nevertheless, outage rates are applied in Servum just to be sure they are accurately represented in the model, and I'm embarrassed to note a couple of typos in that last sentence. This is outage rates in Servum modeling for the 2024 study year. We, as you see, entered an E4 data for battery storage. It doesn't seem like it seems like the E4 is about 5%. The E4D didn't turn out to be significant. Startup probability was about 98% for the batteries. And as you see, we break it down by unit category. The outage information is used to dispatch generators in Servum. Some of these resource types, like batteries and hybrid storage, may have NQC derived from an ELCC or exceedance method that do not use outage rates as an input, but it's still important to simulate the generators accurately. These outage rates are based on class averages by technology type derived from GADS data. Other types of resources like wind, solar, and biomass do not currently have outage rates entered into Servum because, at least for wind and solar, their performance derives from hourly weather profiles. Steam and coal technology types are not used in the RA modeling for 2024, so I didn't show outage rates for them. And outage rates in results partially depend on the usage of that generator in the model over the year. I think that this might be my last slide. We didn't break this down by month, but these are percent outage numbers, and so we have a startup probability, which is an important input. We have an E4 and an E4D. We have other things like maintenance rates, but I don't think we were using maintenance rates in the Ucap calculation, so I just showed what we had here. Are there any, yeah, I just wanted to quickly show what outage data was in our model for comparison. Do people have any questions on this data?
Hey, Donald, looks like there's 2 people in the queue, so I'll go to Sergio.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, my hand was raised for the Kaiser's presentation. I'll lower it now.
Oh, sorry about that, Sergio. Okay, Christian.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. Thanks, Donald. My question goes back to what Bridget was saying. I think she threw out a ballpark estimate that the ambient D rate percentage was, I think, 3%. There was a little crosstalk, so I'm not sure if that was correct. But if I'm understanding, could you just confirm, Servum does not have, the forced outage draws do not have any correlation that could represent that 3% is really occurring, in the tightest RA time period, peak hours and peak days of the year. Is that correct?
That is correct. In addition, these outage rates do not represent ambient derates. These represent equipment failure events that you get from gas, not ambient derates, but that does not include ambient derates.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So ambient derates would be an additional derating on top of this.
Any other questions for Donald? Oh, it looks like Noah jumped in the queue. Noah?
Yeah, thanks. Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Hey, Donald.
Hey.
Question. So how would this, or is Energy Division presenting to propose this data to be used as part of Ucap in the new RA framework? How do you how does it fit in?
Well, if CPUC produced a Ucap calculation for generators, this would probably be the data we would use.
Okay, so it would be a more average value rather than a resource-specific value, because you're.
Yeah, I don't have much to say on that right now. The data in Servum is class averages. We didn't put unit-specific data in Servum, but that I'm not opposed to doing that. I just, yeah, not opposed. Sorry, horn outside.
That's all right. I think I heard you essentially say that it could either be resource specific or class average, and I'm just trying to figure out, is the Energy Division then going to propose have a proposal for a different Ucap for the entire fleet, I guess, rather than a Ucap for thermal and storage? As part of the workshop process and 3B.2.
Yeah, I'm just showing you what is in the model right now and what the model dispatches with these resource types. So this is I'm just comparing. I think this is meant to be a comparison against the outage rates that ISO showed.
Got it. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, last in the queue we have Chris.
Hi, thanks, Rhett. This is Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. Hi, Donald. Thanks for presenting on this. I just had a question for you. If you could maybe help understand how to interpret the difference here between the effective forced outage rate percent and the effective forced outage rate on demand, because I see that there's some that have 0 here for battery storage particularly, and then the hybrids and pump storage hydro. So just curious if you could help me understand that a little bit better. And I guess maybe I would just start by saying my understanding of that, or interpretation of that, would be that those resource types do have outages, but they're generally not in the time when they're actually really impacting or in demand. And that's my understanding of the E4D calculation. So is that what Servum is actually outputting for you guys? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what that statistic means. That the D is demand. Yeah.
Okay, I find it a little bit strange that we're getting this high numbers, 5+% for those, and none of them are actually during the times when they might be, necessarily needed for dispatch. So that part of it is a bit strange to me that it's totally 0%. But obviously, we need to dig into it a little bit more. But I would expect that those numbers would be a lot closer together in general, unless they're just really, well performing over those, kind of more peaky periods. But since forced outages are usually random, I feel like this is a little bit questionable at 0% on some of those. But that's just my reaction.
Well, I'm going to take a look at that. I think I have a similar reaction to you. I'm going to take a look at that to make sure that we didn't do something incorrect in the way we entered this outage data.
Okay, that sounds good, Dom. I appreciate you maybe taking a second look at that. But that was the only thing I wanted to mention. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next we have Kathleen.
Hi, great, thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. This is kind of a basic question, but Donald, I wanted to ask you to confirm that the E4 and E4D methods that are applying, you're using the GADS data and the calculation itself is consistent with the industry calcs, the NERC calcs?
I believe so. I believe the definition of the statistics are the same as the industry standards.
Okay, that's great. No, this is wonderful. I just wanted to commend the CPUC for using these types of calculations and showing us the difference between E4 and E4D. I totally heard what you said about maybe double checking some of those numbers. I think I could, if this is accurate, I could come up with what makes, intuitive sense to me for batteries is that you strive to do everything as a battery operator to be available during the demand periods. But if you could double check the data, that would be very helpful because I don't want to walk away with that assumption if that's an incorrect readout on that.
Yeah. I can speculate, and I think that I don't know enough about how the E4D calculation treats the charging hours versus the discharging hours. I know how combined cycles and CTs are treated because they just, they operate. There is no charging component, so I would like to check to see how the calculation treats charging and discharging hours, or if it's just looking at the discharging hours for this statistic. So
that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, not to interrupt. That would be very helpful. I would have assumed maybe just the discharge, but if you could confirm and maybe we could provide more information through your comments or something, that would be really, or additional presentations would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you know what I find. I'll put some more information out.
Okay, Donald, it doesn't look like there are any other questions, so looks like we're about 10 minutes early, so I think we can start lunch now and then we'll reconvene in 30 minutes. So we'll reconvene at 12:20.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.